Everybody. Man, I got a lady on the channel today that I am super excited that she has come on Strong Inspirations. Oh my God, I tell you, I am finding these, for lack of a better word, heavyweights, nice, conscious, history preserving, want you to know this information, good folk coming on the channel. I am, let me tell you something, I look at it like I'm blessed because I get it firsthand and then I give it to you straight, no chaser. I have learned a lot about history as a result of doing this channel. How about this? Did you know, and there's a video on the channel, I interviewed a lady out of Australia, that Australia initially was a continent full of African-American people? I didn't know that. And then they got invaded and things just kind of took a turn. But nonetheless, this lady grew up in the bushes. She used to walk around naked. And I made a slight sin. I said, I wish I would have seen that. You know what I mean? I didn't mean no harm in that comment, but I'm a guy, right? And then she is now telling the story internationally, got an organization. How about this one? Did you see the video on the channel where the lady is a professor and talked about how bad, and I bet bad in a good way, how much enslaved people wanted to learn how to read and write, and all that they did to teach themselves, when one person knew something, he taught another one? It's on the channel. Did you see the one that I did with the lady out of Ireland? I found her out of Ireland, who says that she knows that one of the people who had come from Ireland, they were once enslaved, they got to America, they enslaved some people, and then the guy had a big plantation and he sold 250 enslaved folk in 2 days. They call it Weeping Times. Watch that video. Did you? And I got a bunch of them on there. We over 250 videos strong, my friends, and I'm interviewing 3, 4, 5 people a week like this lady. You're gonna love this video. I know you're not gonna know what she's talking about. This is incredible. I can't wait. I'm gonna sit here and just come up with some questions. I'm gonna let her do the talking. And so did you see the one I got with the guy from South Africa who says he's a colored? That's what they call him. And he grew up during apartheid, which really was the same thing as Jim Crow. I never thought of it like that. Watch that video. I don't even know if I told you, I'm so excited, lady on the channel. I don't even know if I told you I'm Anthony Brogdon. But nonetheless, how about this? Hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button on this video, because I know you don't know this, but she's gonna tell you. Hit the notifications bell, so when I put the videos up, and I will do one in the middle of the night if I can't sleep, because I figure, hey, sharing this information might help me sleep. So hit the notification bell, tell you when the videos come up, and then tell somebody about Strong Inspiration. Don't keep it to yourself, please. Share the videos. Let this flow, because we talk a lot about how we don't share and don't keep the history alive. Boom, shakalaka, here we are. All right, watch my movie, everybody. I'm serious. I'm a filmmaker. I produced this documentary on the rise of Black business in America. It's called Business in the Black. I took it to 40 cities on my own dime, because I wanted people to hear what I found out. And it's streaming on Amazon. I went one step further than that, and I wrote a book on the same topic, but I put more facts in it. I mean, I got 200 facts. I got a guy, he sent me a message, said, man, I had never heard this guy's name. Julius, the Potato King, Cone, I think Cone's not his last name, can't remember. He became wealthy with potatoes in Kansas. You ain't heard of him. He's in my book. And because some of these facts you've never heard of and you don't believe me, little old me, then I give you the link where I found the fact. And I don't give you no commentary. I'm not trying to dilute the fact, trying to interpret the fact. I'd let the fact stand on its own. Get you a copy of my book, Black Business Book. Go to my website, businessintheblack.net. Another thing, right quick, John, I don't mean to hold up too long, but can y'all imagine little old me? I'm doing my own festival. I got a Black History Festival that I would like 1,000 of y'all to come to. It's gonna be in Kansas City, Kansas, in a neighborhood called Quindaro. The festival is gonna be in the park, in the Quindaro Park. Short story, and there's a video on the channel. During the slavery days, Missouri was a slave state and Kansas wasn't. I mean, and they were separated by a river. Can you imagine that? So if you could get across that river, you had a little shot at it. You know, not to say that he couldn't come over there and try to get you, but nonetheless, you might have had a little shot at it. I interviewed a guy whose great grandfather did that. He walked across that river, check it out, when it froze, and got to Quindaro, hid out enough, opened up a business and provided for his family. I say to myself, man, I got to go see this. I got to see this firsthand. So I decided to put a festival together. Friday night, we're going to party in the barn with a fish fry. Saturday morning, we're going to take tours of the area. And then we're going to have a picnic. And I got the people of the area cooking the food. Now, I ain't talking about catered. I'm talking about just a regular picnic with the hot dogs and the hamburgers and the chicken. And they're known for the ribs. I found somebody's going to cook some ribs. I provide all that for you for a nominal fee. And then Sunday, we're going to stay long enough to see the stars and hear the voices. I want to do that. And then Sunday, we're going to have a church service welcoming you to get there safely as you have and send you home safely. And then we're going to have a brunch. So check that out. That's Memorial Day weekend, May 27th through the 29th, 2022. Now check it out. You hear me use this word strong a lot. It's the name of my company. It's everything I do. It's just a word I chose. Strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And check it out. That is my introduction to my guest today. She's a strong lady. You're going to see for yourself. Introduce yourself. Come on. Thank you for being on Strong Inspirations.
My name's Amy Summers. I'm from Seattle, Washington, and I spent most of my career as an international lawyer focused on China. And I lived in China for many years, and I lived in Shanghai and was really transfixed by the story of Shanghai before 1949.
Okay, hold on. I got to stop you there. Check it out.
Yeah.
I got to ask a couple questions of you because I want my guests to kind of get to know you, as you already alluded. You were born and raised in Seattle?
I was. And I had the great good fortune to grow up in a part of Seattle where the folks it was a integrated neighborhood, and the folks who were the most dynamic and doing the most interesting things and the dominant cultural forces were African-American. And so I was surrounded from a really early age with this idea of Black people as having agency. And not that people talked about it in those terms, but those were the examples I saw before me growing up. And I went to law school in Seattle, which was very white at that time. The University of Washington's law school was super white. But there was an image that I saw there that I'll talk about in a little bit that got me thinking about Black agency in a new way, because there was an image of a man in an early law school class that resonated. But all this to say, I grew up with, on the West Coast of the United States. Seattle is known for looking to Asia. I came of age when the United States and China had just reopened relations and wanted to become a lawyer focused on China, and that's what I did.
Okay.
I retired a few years back and finally had a chance to finish a novel I've been working on, which was published earlier. Well, I guess it was now last year because we're in 2022. Yeah. We're recording this at the beginning of January. And the book is called Rumors from Shanghai. And it is historical fiction, and it tells the story of a Black American who goes to Asia to work in late 1940.
When we talk about Asia in Black history, do you go back as far as how African Americans got there? Because there was a community in some parts of Asia. This is not your area, right?
Well, let me break that down because you've got a lot of in that very astute question. There were Black communities in parts of Asia, maybe most notably in the Philippines, after the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War of 1898. And the US sent all Black regiments to maintain the peace, or as part of their colonization experience, and thousands of Black soldiers were in the Philippines, and some of them stayed.
Okay.
And so there were communities there, but my book actually focuses on this one character who is in Asia, and he has friends who are Chinese and friends who are Japanese. But in the course of doing the research for the book, I learned a lot about African-American engagement in Asia in between World War I and World War II, which is
okay. Let me stop you there then.
Yes.
But I guess I'm getting at there are some, and I've seen pictures going back to what, the 1600s and the 1700s of Africans. I'm sure that's where they came from in Asia. Do you know any of those type stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the most famous example that I think you're referencing is that there was a Black man in, I think, 16th century Japan who was trained as a samurai and was very respected as, so, you know, and there was trade between Asia and Africa, what we now think of as African nations, places on the African continent. And there were sailors who were, you know, for hundreds of years, there were people of African background engaged, you know, coming to Asia. Okay. But my particular interest is in, and then I should add, in the 19th century, you had, in the wake of the Civil War, the American Civil War, and the emancipation of Black people, you had a number of Black people going to Asia to perform, like the Fisk Jubilee Singers did tours throughout Asia. As I mentioned, you had the Spanish-American War, you had people going. You also had the Boxer Rebellion suppression, where American soldiers were part of the multinational force, and there were Buffalo soldiers who went to China in like I guess that was 1901, 1902. One of the earliest, the earliest professional training school for nursing in Japan was started by a Black female missionary. Oh, really? So in the 19th century, there was engagement, but my personal research is in the 20th century. For the 20-some years between the end of World War I, so you know, roughly 1919, on to the outbreak of the war in the Pacific, 1941, there was engagement by Black people in a wide range of realms, and you know, with a lot of impact. But my premise is that Black people, prior to the civil rights, the positive changes of the civil rights era, despite the really oppressive conditions in which they were operating in the United States, managed to use their agency and their imagination. You talked about resilience as being part of the strong inspirations idea, their resilience to pursue fulfillment of their personal dreams and also their professional dreams in Asia. I was so struck by this idea that, you know, we think of Seattle as being super white, that a Black man was going to the University of Washington and studying this very specialized field, law. And I went on to learn that his name was William McDonald Austin, and he had been born in Barbados, and I don't know how old he was when he came to the United States. But he came to Seattle specifically to study law. He had been living in California, and he did very well. He graduated in 1992, and in that summer, he took the bar exam and he passed on the first time with a very good score. And he tried to find a job, and no law firms or government agencies would hire him. So in the autumn of 1902, he left. And at the time I started the book, that was all I knew. I mean, I didn't find any records of him in the Washington State Bar Association or anything. And in my story, my protagonist, who is an amalgamation of Austin and some other real early Black Seattleites, is unable to find a job. And so through the connections of his grandfather, my protagonist goes to Asia because he's offered a job there. And I later learned that that's actually what had happened to Austin, that he had gone to work in the Philippines where he had ties. And I've since learned, but I haven't yet gotten to the detail of it, that he went to work for the American colonial government in the Philippines. These are a couple of images. The one on the right is of Bud Clayton, who was from Missouri, You mentioned Missouri and Kansas in
Sure.
your introduction. And he was a trombonist, and he was invited by another Black, very talented musician, Teddy Weatherford, to bring his band to China in the 1930s. And he worked in Shanghai with the Harlem Gentlemen. And this is them at one of the premier night spots. You can see how glamorous that is. And then this picture on the left is the dance floor there. So if you look at, you wanted me to talk about African-American engagement in Asia, and to the extent people are aware of it, going back to your point about how important it is to preserve history, they tend to think of it as being really the purview of musical performers. That's the most commonly known area for Black people to be involved in Asia in between 1920 and 1940. And it's true, they were, and it's a fascinating story. Here's a little clip of a map. I mean, they were all over. They were in Tokyo, up in northern China, Shanghai I mentioned, which was really the key point in China for combining Western and Chinese influences. They were down in Hong Kong, which at that time belonged to the British. And there was this whole circuit that people would travel down, to Manila in the Philippines, to Jakarta, what we now know as Jakarta. It was called something else when the Dutch controlled it. To Malaysia. And then also you can see at the far left of that map, Calcutta. And Teddy Weatherford, who was considered, he was, I think, originally from Chicago, who was considered one of the best stride piano players of that era, left Chicago to go play in Shanghai in the 1920s, and then got recruited to go to Calcutta. And he's credited with really introducing and popularizing jazz in Calcutta in the 20s and 30s, and he tragically died of dysentery, I think in the early 40s. But they also inspired local artists to innovate in their own forms of jazz. Midge Williams, who grew up in an all-Black town in California, although she was born in Oregon, was part of a very talented family, and she toured in the early 30s in China and in Tokyo. And in Tokyo in particular, her performances were seen as really groundbreaking. And in between the sets, the local musicians would ask her to give them essentially like master classes on voice control and how she did what she did. And they were so impressed with her that they asked her to make recordings. And she had never made recordings in the United States, but she made recordings in Japanese of jazz standards that for decades were considered really influential.
And so they were accepted as musicians. Did they face, as they might have faced in America, the racial, you can't come in the front door, the segregational type things that they faced here?
Well, that is such a great question. And the answer to it, I find fascinating, because again and again, when you read the accounts, and not just of the musicians, but of other Black people who were there in other fields, what comes through is that they were often treated really well by the local people who saw, if you were a local person in, say, China or India, and you had been dealing with colonialism and white supremacy and oppression, you knew enough to know that the people who were Black, who were darker skinned as well, were suffering a similar plight. And so they tended to be very welcoming, the local people, to the Black Americans who were there for different reasons. But the white people who were there, working or doing whatever, often were the source of that kind of Jim Crow thinking. So to have a very illustrious career playing with some of the biggest names in jazz, and he traveled all over Europe. He had a great life. But in his memoir, he says, "I still say today that the 2 years I spent in China were the happiest years of my life. My life seemed to begin in Shanghai. We were recognized for a change." But why did they leave Shanghai? Well, partly it was because the Japanese were making noises about invading, but also it was because racist whites ginned up a fight at this big entertainment place, this very prestigious entertainment place where they were performing, and that ended up being an excuse to break the contract with them, and then they could never get quite as good a job as the situation changed. So to the extent that African Americans talked about their experiences and racism, it tended to be that the white people brought their prejudices with them and then would impose them on these, public venues or other kinds of interactions manifested. But nevertheless, the overall experience, because they did find resonance with the local people, was really positive.
What kind of venues were these that they were performing at?
Well, there were a variety of different kinds. Some were fancy ballrooms in hotels. The one in this picture here was the Canadrome, which was this huge complex. And then there were freestanding nightclubs and ballrooms and cabarets. So
was
yes.
there some restrictions, visas and things like that they would have had to get to go there to perform?
Yeah, at that time, it was really kind of an open field. There was not a restriction on travel such as we would see today. But yeah, it wasn't so much a legal visa restriction, it was more the logistics of getting there. And especially in the 30s, when money was very tight for people.
Sure.
That was an issue.
Sure.
And so, as I mentioned, jazz is the area, to the extent people know about Black engagement with Asia, jazz is the area that they tend to know about. But in my research, I've learned, and I'm sure there are other people who know this too. It's not like I'm, innovating something necessarily,
Sure.
but I've learned that actually it was a much broader range of engagement, and in some ways it resonated in ways that really aren't recognized today. And it covered faith, faith endeavors, international relations, educational endeavors, journalism, writing, intellectual thinking, as well as the entertainment sphere. And the entertainment sphere wasn't, limited necessarily to jazz, but that just is the one that's best known. So
and I know as you move up the timeline, so to speak, and maybe I'm going a little ahead of myself with this question, Asia, they're not always an ally of America.
Well, that's a really interesting point. So the period I'm looking at is, roughly 1919 to 1941. In 1937, Japan invaded China, and the situation started to get tenser. And and increasingly in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, of course, there was tension between the United States and Japan. Japanese government made outreach to, and various, universities and thinkers in Japan made outreach to African Americans to ally with them. And people like W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about Japan as a positive example of throwing off the effects of white domination as early as 1905. So there was some sense of connection there. And as I'll talk about in a minute, in the faith field, with India and with China, you see this very clearly. And Blackness actually turns out to be a benefit if you are trying to create alliances or connection around matters of faith, because Christianity had been so tarnished by the acts of colonizing white people, whether from England and India,
okay,
or white Americans in other parts of Asia.
So now let's go up through the W. Du Bois and whatever, next slides and that.
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
thing.
So, so I mentioned that, there are these different areas, and the first one I wanted to talk about was faith. So, I think it's fair to say that in mainstream media or generalized teaching about the civil rights movement in the United States, the impression that's given is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was aware of Gandhian philosophy and tactics, and that he used that knowledge to develop an approach to dealing with the oppressive legal and social system in the United States that led to profound change. And that's true. But as I'm going to talk now, it's actually a much more complex process. And it started decades earlier in Asia with Black people, including a Black woman, which is, women are typically elided or not emphasized enough in the development of the American civil rights movement, playing a key role in recognizing the significance of what Gandhi was trying to do. So remember, in the 1920s, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that India was going to be able to become independent from England and do so in a nonviolent way. And as early as 1929, there were several Black American who were involved in the international YWCA, YMCA movement, who went to India, went to Mysore, India, to an international YMCA conference, who were first exposed to the ideas that Gandhi had been developing. And one of them was this woman, Juliet Delacott, or excuse me, yeah, Delacott, or Derricott, excuse me. And she's in this photograph here. You can see her, let's see, sheet number 4.
Okay.
Yeah, she is, Miss Derricott. So she is a fascinating figure, and she's kind of forgotten today, but she grew up in kind of humble circumstances and in the South, and her family was from Georgia. And she, as a high school student, became very involved in the YWCA, and then went to college and became active in a governance role, and then went to work for the YWCA at their headquarters in New York. And she was appointed to this national role. She worked as a secretary there, but she was also appointed to a national role where she traveled all over the United States, meeting with college and young people, college students and young people's groups, and trying to get them more active in the Y movement. And at that time, the Y movement was going through a bit of internal tension because of this question of whether it was going to be integrated, or where you're going to have a Black Y system and a white Y system. And she was this person who, you know, by all accounts was super impressive. And while she was working in New York for them, she also did a master's degree at Columbia University. So think about this, you know, at a time when very few women went to college, much less Black people were able to go to college. She went to college, got an advanced degree from one of the top universities in America. And then she got selected for this international role where she traveled overseas for the Y to attend these global meetings as one of, you know, very few Americans who would go. Sure. And she went to this one in India. And then as part of it, it was an around the world trip. She went to various Asian countries, to Shanghai, she went to Hong Kong, and I forget where else. Mm-hmm. But after she came back, she and the other students who had gone, Frank Wilson, who later became a Presbyterian minister, would be asked to give talks about Gandhian methodology to the students at Howard University. And we know, of course, how important Howard was in American Black experience.
Sure.
And tragically, she became the Dean of Women at Fisk. And another person who is really important to the process of adapting or importing Gandhian methodology was Howard Thurman, who was a very respected minister and academic, and is seen today sort of as the intellectual godfather of the civil rights movement. He was asked to lead a delegation to go to India and Burma and Sri Lanka in 1935-36. And he's considered that delegation is considered the first group of Americans to actually meet with Gandhi in India. And they spent hours, first off, on this trip, they were asked because the Indian Christian movement knew how discredited Christianity was by virtue of the actions of the English white Christians. Sure. And so they really wanted this Black delegation to be with them to try and engage younger people. And they gave dozens upon dozens of lectures and meetings all around the country. It was a very rigorous trip, but towards the end of it, they had this long meeting with Gandhi, and Thurman was so entranced by what he heard that really it shaped the rest of his life's work. And Thurman went on to, he and his wife, who I'll talk about in a minute, were just sort of this power couple, and they set up the first integrated, really mainstream church in America. And he wrote many books, and one of his books, written in 1949, became very important to Martin Luther King Jr. It talked about very concretely about how the gospel had a social justice mission, and that by using the peaceful means promoted by Gandhi, you could change America to create more justice, as contemplated by the gospel. So all this to say, this was a process that, you know, we now benefit from, having a society that's fairer in legal terms, although not perfect. And it's a process that began by African Americans going to Asia in the 1920s, which is kind of amazing, right? We don't do it that way.
Sure.
And, I mentioned that this was considered advantageous that they were Black. Another testimonial to this was there was a missionary named Edward Carter who he was an evangelical missionary who went to India in the 1920s and created a very successful mission there. And then on his way back, one of his children became very ill and they had to get off the boat in Shanghai, and he ended up starting a missionary endeavor in China. And this was at a time of tension in China, specifically anti-foreign tension. And he wrote about how actually he was able to go places that white Westerners couldn't go, and that his, considered his identity as a Black man made him more trustworthy. It made him more effective.
I love it.
Yeah. So, these are examples of where often I think people think that, okay, people in Asia wouldn't want to deal with these Black people because we know how Black people were seen in the United States. But at that time, that was not the case. Now, the situation now with mass media is a little bit more complex, but,
sure.
But at that time, in some ways, Blackness was an advantage and enabled these people to fulfill their personal aspirations and make an impact in connecting with people that in ways that were very resonant.
Sure. Okay.
So another area of endeavor was in international relations. The guy who became the foreign minister of China in the 1920s, Eugene Chen, depending on how you pronounce it, was from a Chinese family in Trinidad, which is part of the Americas broadly. He married a woman who is French and of African descent.
Really?
And he was a very successful lawyer, very rich man. And his son Percy followed in his footsteps and went to England for training in law. And then when he completed his training, his father by that time was the foreign minister of China and had pretty much given up all his wealth to the Chinese Revolution. And he called for Percy to go to China, and Percy Chan in the 1920s served as an aide to his father. And then later he served as an aide to Sun Yat-sen's son in Chongqing during the period that the Chinese government had to move inland after the Japanese invasion. And then after the war, he moved to Hong Kong, and he had a long career as a barrister and he was kind of a bridging person between the Chinese communists.
And she went along with him all these trips, evidently.
Yeah, so he spent some time in Russia. This photograph is actually taken of him and his sister, one of his sisters in Russia, and I love how elegant they all look.
Yeah, sure.
And James Weldon Johnson is another person who had an impact internationally. Johnson is known today mostly as having written the lyrics for Lift Every Voice and Sing,
right,
the Black national anthem.
Right.
But he was also kind of a Renaissance man. I mean, he was an educator. I think he was the first Black person to pass the bar exam in Florida in the 19th century.
We know that.
He was an educator both at the high school level and then at the college level. He was the first Black tenured professor at New York University. And he was the first Black executive secretary of the NAACP.
Yep.
And he was also a really important figure in the Harlem Renaissance in terms of literature.
Right.
So he had been appointed a diplomatic representative of the United States in, I'm trying to think, it was Nicaragua and Panama during the Roosevelt and McKinley administration. So that was like 1909, 1911. So he had this really broad experience. And in the 1920s, this International Institute was started in Hawaii that aimed to be a way to bring people of the Asia Pacific together to talk about issues of common concern. And they met every 2 years. Okay. And the Japanese were very engaged in this. It's called the Institute of Pacific Relations. And going back to my earlier point that Japan saw the African-American experience as relevant to their own experience and aims, they really want to have African-American engagement in this institute's meetings, but the white people felt that Black people had nothing relevant to say about international relations. They had this very blinkered view.
Yeah, sure.
And so, but ultimately in 1929, the Japanese delegation was going to host the conference. And so the Americans felt compelled to bring a member who was African-American, and they asked James Weldon Johnson, who was treated as a superstar when he showed up. And, the press came on board the ship even before he got off and interviewed him. And they were super knowledgeable about his work. He was followed on the streets of Tokyo before he went down to Kyoto. He was invited to attend a garden party by the emperor. So he was seen, and the things he said were reported in the press as, important things to say about international relations. But what's interesting in his memoir, he talks about how he could see disputes and tension arising between the Japanese and the Chinese delegations. And he really wanted to share his experience as a Black person about what needed to be done to work through this. And nobody wanted to hear him. So on the one hand, his viewpoint was welcome, but when it really came down to where he could offer useful insights, and this maybe is not surprising given the tendencies of people around the world, people didn't really want to hear about it. So,
okay. Which that kind of leads to this question. With them receiving such acclaim overseas, was there, did people in America know that this was happening for them, and that the media said, hey, man, we're not reporting that. We don't want the people to hear these great things of what these African Americans were accomplishing?
Right. So this is where the African American press played a really important role, because they tended to cover these stories with a lot of detail. If you do research into stories in this period, you'll see references in the African American press from around the country, the Baltimore Afro-American and from the Chicago Defender, from all over, about very detailed things like Miss Nora Holt is going back to Europe, and then from there she's going to Shanghai to perform again. And so the African American press was really onto the fact that Black people were doing this stuff, but it gets much less coverage in the white mainstream press. And to the extent there is coverage, it tends to be much blander and doesn't really convey the significance of what was going on.
Sure. Okay.
Some things don't change, right?
What's the next one?
Okay. So education is another area. So, Benjamin Mays was the first dean of the School of Religion at Howard, and then he went on to become the head of Morehouse, and was really seen as kind of a second father to Martin Luther King Jr. After his friend Howard Thurman went to India, Mays then went to India to meet with Gandhi, and that shaped some of his thinking and teachings. And he went on, of course, to teach some of the most important people in the civil rights movement. I mentioned Howard Thurman's wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, who herself was a very respected educator. And she had been working on women's issues prior to going to India. But then after meeting with Gandhi, she really became convinced that Black women needed explicitly to focus on international relations. And that really informed a lot of her work going forward. Okay. And she also was very good friends with Juliet Derricott. And so after Derricott had died, and then Sue Bailey Thurman had gone to India, she saw that there was an opportunity, there was a benefit to having these kinds of exchanges. And she set up a scholarship program so that African-American female students could go to India. A number of them did in the 1930s, which is pretty cool. Thinking again, like this was a time when there was not a lot of resources and money, but she was able to do this. And also to bring Indian female students to go to historically Black colleges in America.
I love it.
So these people were trying to create these connections at a time when, overall the United States was in a depression, and then Black people were often suffering the worst. And yet they saw the possibilities for trying to promote international relations and international understanding. And then I mentioned that there were intellectuals who were also engaging with Asia. And Hughes and Du Bois were both very active, but they had very different takes. So Du Bois, as I mentioned, was following Japan from 1905 onwards, and he was very pro-Japan. In 1936, the Japanese government arranged a whole tour for him to go and visit the country that Japan had set up when it carved off Manchuria from China, Manchukuo, and that he also visited Japan and China. Du Bois was disgusted by Shanghai. He thought it reminded him of there's the Chinese he saw as servile. He saw them as kind of parroting the worst of the Jim Crow South, and he was really disgusted by it. And he saw the Japanese as proud and unbowed and doing good things. And so he was very pro-Japan really up until World War II. Even after Japan invaded China in 1937, he refused to denounce them. So his judgment in this regard did not stand up well. And later in his life, he did apologize. He spent the last years of his life living in China, and he apologized for his stand. Yeah. In fact, I knew a guy who was the first American member of the Chinese Communist Party who had a long and interesting career in China. And he knew Du Bois from that time. And he told me that Du Bois felt a lot of remorse and this was in the early 60s, he expressed this, Du Bois felt a lot of remorse for the stance he had taken vis-a-vis Japan towards China in the 1930s. But at the time that he and Hughes were going there, he was firmly in the Japan camp. Now, Hughes had gone a couple of years earlier, and he had gone to Asia after going first to Russia to work on a film, and that never was developed. And many of the Black artists who were going to be working on this film stayed in Russia, which is a topic for another day. But Hughes carried on, and he kept going east, and he went to China, and he loved it. And where Du Bois saw people as servile, he saw the Chinese as sort of being resilient, and people would warn, Westerners would warn him not to go to certain local parts of the city because it was dangerous. And Hughes talked about how, going to your earlier question about Jim Crowism, how he might not be allowed by the Westerners in certain public venues, but the Chinese welcomed him anywhere, and he felt safer with the Chinese than he did with the white Westerners.
Oh man.
But then when he got to Japan, because he had come from Russia, and he also met with some leftist elements in Shanghai, he was interrogated. He was taken to the police station in Tokyo and interrogated, and he was actually kicked out of the country and told never to return. So he had a very negative experience in Japan because they were so strongly anti-communist, and they saw him, because he had ties to leftists, as being a bad actor. So, and in his writing, Hughes wrote very sympathetically about China's experience. And so his understanding of what was going on then has held up better, I would say, than Du Bois's.
Okay, what's the next one? For the
last one is just circling back to entertainment. So, we talked about jazz, but Black baseball players played a really important role in helping popularize a game that had been brought to Japan as early as the 1860s and 70s. Yeah. And this is a fascinating, we don't have time probably to talk about today, but it's, I've got the link there to that NPR story. And it's just such an interesting little example or lens, because the Black players went to Japan and were super respectful and appreciative of the experience and played very honorably, even though they beat the Japanese players most of the time. Later, the white major league players went, and they were very scornful. They didn't like to eat the food. They did things like play with an umbrella over their head, and they would just trounce the Japanese and kind of make fun of them. And so they the white players left a very negative impression, but the Black players were seen as much better sportsmen. And so and this, just my final slide is thank you for having me on. And this is, I started out saying that what set me on this quest was this photograph of a real man who I imagined in a different context, William McDonald Austin. But in the course of doing that research, I learned about a real Seattleite who really was in Shanghai, Robert Wayne Adams. And this is a picture of the Earl Whaley Orchestra, which he played with. And I love this photograph because it shows them on a plane, which I think of as evoking the Boeing connection with Seattle, but they're above Shanghai. It's obviously a created image, not really taken above Shanghai, but it's such a cool photograph, and he stayed in Shanghai for a number of years. So all that to say is my story is historical fiction, but there are a lot of really fascinating, true connections by African Americans in Asia in this period that show imagination, resiliency, agency, and impact. And I just really hope that more people recognize this part of our history.
Yeah, I love it.
So,
let me end, for sake of time, on this note, and I'm not ending. Isn't it kind of amazing that what you're talking about is less than 50 years, 70 years after the end of slavery, that these people were this astute, this educated, this
moxie
to even not just look at what was going on here in America, but had a global view.
Yes. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's so true. I mean, this is the thing. So I will say, so my book is historical fiction. It's, I've made up the story, but it's grounded in a lot of research. And one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is that thus far, when Black people read my book, well, both Black and white people, when they read the book, they're like, oh, it's really, engrossing, interesting story. Very good. But when Black people read it, they're like, oh, and this guy your protagonist seems, believable. We believe that a Black man could be functioning at this high level in this international environment. That strikes us as real. White people don't think that that's real. They say,
I can't imagine.
They say that's, having this Black character isn't really believable. But if you put that aside, it's a very interesting story. So, it shows to me how pervasive this thinking about limitations is, that white people cannot imagine that in the pre-civil rights era, as you say, not that many decades after the end of chattel slavery, that Black people were managing to exert agency and thrive in these ambitious fields, but they were. I mean,
And so let's say we close on this one. The guy that you said went to law school in Seattle, how do you think he found out to go to Asia to get a job in Asia?
I know. I still haven't found the answer to that, but I have a theory, which I will share with you.
Yes.
Which is
there was no internet, so he couldn't look it up.
There was no internet.
Nothing like that.
But there was sort of this network of Black elite people who had connections to the Republican Party still. And Washington, what's his name? The Washington who is it Carver Washington?
George Washington Carver?
Yeah, George Washington I think it was he who was seen as like a linchpin and was able to send like in the period, the colonial period after the Spanish-American War, he and connected people, Black people in DC argued that the government, that the Roosevelt administration should send Black people to help with the colonial occupation and actually get rid of surplus Black people to go live and settle in the Philippines. So, and that idea resonated for racist white people in the South, because by then, Reconstruction had ended, and the lens was that Black people were a problem.
Yeah. Okay.
So
now what you're saying is, just like they did a Back to Africa movement, they did try to do something to go to the Asia.
Yes, to the Philippines.
Oh,
which
really?
was yeah. So that's, but I don't know for a fact that that's why William McDonald Austin went there. But that's my operating theory as of January 2022.
And so there was something to that. For everybody, my viewers, man, let me tell you something. This lady too deep for me. I had
to be continued.
That, but I got some people on the channel who said some of the entertainers went to Europe.
Yes.
Yeah, that happened quite often. I mean,
that's the better known story. Yeah. To the extent that people know about Black people going overseas as artists, they tend to think of it as Europe.
Yes, yes. Well,
Like
what was the
Josephine
lady with the
Baker is the
bananas?
most, yeah, Josephine Baker is the most
Yeah,
famous.
yeah, she's huge, you know.
Yeah,
She
right.
was huge over there, and a number of other people.
Yeah.
Everybody, whew, I'm telling you, I got no more questions. When she wants to come on, we'll do it again. Before I stop there, how do people get your book?
You can buy it on Amazon.
Okay.
And you can buy it from, you can request your local bookstore.
Yeah, yeah. And
Membership's
what's your
high.
website? Do you have a website?
I do have my website.
Yes.
It's Amy Summers, SOMMERS
Yes.
.net. www.amysummers.net.
Thank you so very much for coming on the
Thank
channel.
you.
Everybody, did I tell you, I really didn't know how deep this was going to go. I'm glad I slept well last night, or at least I took a nap today to be able to handle the deepness on this one. Hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspiration sooner or later. Hit the like button on this video because it's deep. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up, you get notified. Tell somebody, don't keep this to yourself. Let it go around the world. Because we got people watching us around the world, and we interview people around the world, and we talk about things that have happened around the world, as our guest has done today. Do all those things. And to you, I say this with all sincerity, and I mean this, please. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I really like that you have found this as your angle, at least one of them. I'm sure you talk about other things after living there, but somehow, as you alluded in the video, you chose this to do some time and some research.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing. I mean, oh my God, this is beautiful. So please continue. We're going to help promote that book and all that you want to say in any form that you say it. So that I'll say thank you for again coming on the show, and everybody, bye-bye, we out.
Thanks,
Peace.
Mr. Brogdon.
Okay, one more thing. How do you say goodbye in what is it, Japanese or
I speak
Chinese?
Mandarin Chinese. 再见.
There you go. That's the closing word. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.